I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor, and worse. This is Liberation Day in D.C., and we're going to take our capital back. We're taking it back. Under the authorities vested in me as the President of the United States, I'm officially invoking Section 740 of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. You know what that is? And placing the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department under direct federal control, and you'll be meeting the people that will be directly involved with that. Very good people, but they're tough, and they know what's happening, and they've done it before. In addition, I'm deploying the National Guard to help reestablish law, order, and public safety in Washington, D.C., and they're going to be allowed to do their job properly.
Hello, Bobby Jones here from MeidasTouch and Valor Media Networks. Today, we need to talk about something truly unprecedented. President Trump's move to federalize law enforcement in Washington, D.C. Sending federal troops or agents into the nation's capital to perform local policing is almost unheard of, done only in the rarest and most extreme circumstances. Yet this week, Trump is doing just that under conditions that hardly justify such drastic actions. In this video, we're going to break down the historical context of federal troops in D.C., how exceptionally rare it is to use federal forces in local law enforcement without state or local consent, how Trump has a pattern of targeting Democratic-led, often minority-majority communities with these tactics, and why it's utterly unnecessary in Washington, D.C., given falling crime rates. But most importantly, we'll discuss how normalizing this kind of federal intrusion into local policing is a dangerous step that America must not allow. Let's start with some history. When has a U.S. president ever deployed federal troops into Washington, D.C. itself? Only in the most extreme examples and emergencies. Here are a few of them. In 1932, during the Great Depression, thousands of World War I veterans camped in Washington, D.C. to demand early payment of bonuses and pensions. In July 1932, President Herbert Hoover sent the U.S. Army, led by General Douglas MacArthur himself, to forcibly evict these veterans. Troops with bayonets and even tanks cleared camps with tear gas and fire. It was a shocking use of military force against peaceful demonstrators who also had worn the nation's uniform. And it remains a dark stain in our history to this day. In 1968, after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, riots erupted in more than 100 cities. Washington, D.C. saw some of the worst unrest, and President Lyndon Baines Johnson responded by deploying over 13,000 federal troops into Washington, D.C. to restore order. Those troops patrolled the streets and enforced curfew until calm returned. This was done only because the city was literally up in flames after a national tragedy. Fast forward to 2021. On January 6, 2021, a violent mob of Trump's own supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol. In response, federal authorities eventually deployed the National Guard to secure Washington, D.C. and quell the insurrection. This was an extraordinary event. And to this day, it's believed that it was actually the Vice President of the United States, Vice President Pence, who deployed the National Guard and not President Trump himself, as he was reluctant to do so since the riot was being held in his honor. And so in the most extreme case in Washington, D.C.'s history, President Trump did not want to deploy the National Guard. That being said, so let's talk about how rare it is for federal policing without local consent to occur. Beyond Washington, D.C., it's incredibly uncommon for presidents to insert federal forces into any city or local law enforcement without the consent of the state governor or those local officials. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 generally forbids the U.S. military from acting as a police force on U.S. soil, and the Insurrection Act is one of the few legal mechanisms to override that, but it's invoked again only in extreme cases. Historically, when presidents have used troops in American communities, it's almost always been as a last resort and often to enforce federal law when local authorities could not, or in some cases would not, do so. Some of those historical examples are in Arkansas. In 1957, the governor defied federal school desegregation orders, so President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division and federalized the Arkansas National Guard to escort Black students into Central High School. This was the first time since Reconstruction that the federal troops were needed to enforce civil rights, an extraordinary step to uphold the Constitution. President Kennedy had to follow suit in the Deep South in 1962 and 1963. He sent federal troops and marshals to Oxford, Mississippi in 1962 so James Meredith, a black man, could enroll at the University of Mississippi while facing down a segregationist mob. In 1963, he federalized Alabama's National Guard to make Governor George Wallace stand aside and allow black students into the University of Alabama. These actions, taken over obstinate governors, were drastic but necessary to enforce federal law and protect citizens' rights. Needless to say, they changed America forever. It's important to see Trump's latest move in context. It isn't the first time he's tried to send federal law enforcement or troops into specific communities, and there's a clear pattern to his choices of where he sends them. He targets cities and areas led by Democrats and often have large African American or minority populations. In the summer of 2020, with an election looming, Trump hyped a law and order agenda. He announced a surge of federal law enforcement officers into a handful of Democratic-run cities, including Chicago and Albuquerque. This came right after federal agents in combat gear notoriously cracked down on protests in Portland, Oregon. Trump explicitly framed this as sending help to cities, quote, plagued by violent crime, unquote, but he made it very political, bragging that the cities in trouble were all run by Democrats. Chicago's Mayor Lori Lightfoot was so alarmed that she said, under no circumstances will I allow Donald Trump's troops to come to Chicago and terrorize our residents. Other mayors, too, feared this was more about optics and intimidation rather than public safety. Fast forward to earlier this year, Los Angeles, another diverse city led by Democrats, saw protests against aggressive immigration raids. Rather than work with California officials, Trump deployed National Guard and even active duty Marines to LA in June of 2025. About 700 Marines were put on standby near the city, armed with shields and batons. This was done over the objections of California's governors and leaders. In fact, California's Governor Gavin Newsom sued, arguing Trump violated the Posse Comitatus Act by using military in a policing role. That has led to a landmark trial that is currently underway, highlighting how Trump's actions are breaking from long-standing norms against deploying soldiers on American streets. As Reuters reported, this legal challenge is scrutinizing Trump's use of force in LA, which raised alarms about the president disregarding the 19th century law meant to keep military out of civilian law enforcement. And so now in Washington, D.C. in 2025, the nation's capital, which is deeply Democratic with a large black population and ran by a black mayor, Trump is fixated on it. He's portrayed D.C. as a crime-ridden anarchist jurisdiction. This week, he threw his support behind calls for federal government to take over D.C., and he publicly pledged to evict homeless people from D.C. and jail the criminals, inflammatory rhetoric suggesting he wants to play strongman on the nation's capital city streets. To do this, Trump's administration has already deployed hundreds of federal law enforcement officers to D.C., and now he's activating hundreds of National Guard in the district. Remember, in D.C.'s case, unlike any state, Trump doesn't need a governor's permission. He directly controls the D.C. National Guard. This falls in line with his policy towards American cities, only he doesn't have to deal with the administrative overhead. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, he's frequently called these cities out that are majority black or heavily minority in speeches and tweets, painting them as hellholes of crime that federal intervention can only save. Never mind that local leaders often reject or never ask for his help. By portraying blue cities as lawless and dangerous, he's able to then use the federal force and government and come in like a savior, quote, to clean it up, unquote. It's a tactic that smacks of authoritarianism and also, in this case, racial bias, since it consistently demonizes areas where people of color live. Factoring in the demographics of the people of where he wants to deploy federal troops is one thing, but perhaps the most outrageous aspect of Trump's push to crack down on Washington, D.C. is that it's completely unnecessary by the numbers. Trump is justifying this federal occupation by claiming the capital city is in the grip of a massive crime wave. But that claim is 100% false. Even DC's own police statistics and the mayor say so. So let's look at the data. According to the Metropolitan Police Department, violent crime in Washington, D.C. has been falling, not rising. In fact, violent crime in the district dropped 26% in the first 7 months of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. Overall crime is down about 7%. this year to date. These are substantial decreases, and it's not just a one-year blip. Mayor Muriel Bowser noted that while 2023 did see a spike in certain crimes, the city's recent efforts have been successful in reversing that. This is not 2023, Bowser said, pointing out that over the last 2 years, Washington, D.C. has driven violent crime down to a 30-year low. Think about that. By the end of 2024, violent crime in Washington, D.C. was at its lowest level in 3 decades. Homicides, robberies, carjackings, all of these major crime categories plunged in 2024. The trend for 2025 so far continues to show improvement and not deterioration. And this raises a crucial question. If crime is actually down, why is Trump so eager to send federal troops and agents to Washington, D.C.? If D.C. residents are not crying out for an occupying force, indeed, the city's elected officials and community leaders oppose it, then what's the real purpose? The answer appears to be political theater and normalization. Trump is using D.C. as a stage to perform his tough on crime act, perhaps to distract from other issues, Epstein, or to set a precedent for exerting federal control over Democratic-led localities. It's about power and precedent, not public safety. By forcing federal policing into a city that hasn't asked for it and doesn't need it, he's attempting to normalize a deeply abnormal practice. This brings us to the final and most important point. America cannot allow this to become a new normal. History, both our own and around the world, teaches us a clear lesson about what happens when leaders routinely use military or federal forces as local police. It's a bright red warning sign of authoritarianism. Around the world, when democracies start blurring the line between military and police, freedom erodes. Scholars who study democratic governance point out that a key feature of a healthy democracy is keeping soldiers out of civilian law enforcement. A 2019 study on militarized law enforcement in Latin America found that using armed forces in policing completely undermines the quality of democracy, eroding citizen security, human rights, and the rule of law. In other words, militarizing law enforcement tends to make things worse, not better. It breeds fear and abuse, and genuinely safety or trust are eliminated. Even in the United States, our own history reinforces why we must resist this trend. The founding fathers were deeply worried of a standing army operating on American soil against its citizens. Why? Because they remembered the British soldiers in colonial times and the Boston Massacre. That's why we ultimately got posse comitatus and the tradition of civilian policing. It's why every time the military has been used at home, it's been seen as an emergency exception, not a standard or a rule. When Trump casually sends troops into our cities, he's chipping away at that American tradition of restraint. It's a profound shift towards a more militarized state. And today is Washington, D.C. and L.A. Tomorrow, it could be your city or your town.
New Meidas merch drop. Check out the latest pro-democracy sticker packs, t-shirts, hats, sweatshirts, and more. All at store.MeidasTouch.com.